the human mind is a fragile vessel for the storage of history, especially when fear is the ink used to write the memories. There exists a collective memory shared by thousands of people regarding a specific photograph that ostensibly proves the existence of monsters in the American West. This photograph depicts a massive winged creature nailed to the side of a wooden barn, with a line of men standing before it to provide scale. Countless individuals claim to have seen this image in old books or magazines or newspapers from the turn of the century. They recall the leathery wings and the beak that looked prehistoric, and the haunting expression of the dead beast. However, the terrifying reality is that this photograph does not exist in any known archive. It is a ghost of a memory. The setting of this enigma is the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory in the late 19th century. The town of Tombstone stands as a testament to the grit and desperation of the silver prospectors and cowboys who tried to tame the Wild West. It was a place where life was cheap, and the desert sun bleached the bones of those who failed to survive the elements. The year was 1890, and the region was rife with legends of things that lurked in the canyons and the abandoned mine shafts. The atmosphere was thick with dust, and the smell of sagebrush, and the constant low-level anxiety that comes from living on the edge of the known world. In this environment, stories traveled faster than the wind. Long before the white settlers arrived, the indigenous peoples of the region spoke of the Thunderbird. This was not merely a large bird, but a supernatural entity capable of creating storms with the beat of its wings. The Alini and the Sioux and the Arapaho all had variations of this legend. But in the Arizona desert, the story took on a more physical and terrifying form. The settlers viewed these legends with a mixture of skepticism and superstitious dread. They were men of rifles and lead who believed they could conquer nature through force. Yet the nights in the desert were long and filled with strange noises that did not belong to coyotes or mountain lions. The darkness held ancient secrets. The specific incident that sparked the legend reportedly occurred in April of 1890. Two cowboys were riding their horses through the Dragoon Mountains located just northeast of Tombstone. These were hardened men who had spent their lives in the saddle and were not easily spooked by the local fauna. As they navigated the rocky terrain and the dry riverbeds, they spotted something resting on a ledge high above them. At first, they assumed it was a large condor, or perhaps a stranded calf. But as they drew closer, the sheer scale of the creature became apparent. It was not covered in feathers, but rather it had smooth skin and bat-like wings that were folded against its massive torso. The size of the creature was impossible for the human mind to immediately comprehend without panic setting in. The cowboys later reported that the beast looked like a winged alligator with a tail that was extremely long and thick. Its head was distinct, with a long beak that was filled with sharp teeth rather than the smooth beak of a bird. The eyes were described as being the size of dinner plates, and they held a cold and reptilian intelligence. This was a creature that belonged to a different epoch, a time when dinosaurs ruled the earth. The fear it instilled in the horses caused them to rear and whinny in terror, threatening to throw their riders onto the unforgiving rocks below. The landscape around them seemed to hold its breath as the confrontation began. The heat waves shimmering off the rocks distorted the air, making the monster appear even more surreal. The cowboys knew that they were miles from civilization, and that if this beast decided to attack, they would be at a severe disadvantage. The sheer cliffs of the Dragoon Mountains provided no cover, and the open desert floor was a killing field for an aerial predator. They gripped their Winchester rifles with sweaty palms and tried to calm their panicked mounts. The silence of the desert was broken only by the heavy breathing of the horses and the clicking of rifle hammers being pulled back. Suddenly, the creature stirred from its slumber. It opened its massive wings, which were said to span over 160 feet from tip to tip. The sound of the wings unfolding was like the cracking of a heavy canvas sail in a gale force wind. Dust and small stones were kicked up by the movement, creating a localized cloud that obscured the vision of the men. It was not a normal bird, and it did not move like one. The movements were jerky and powerful, displaying a muscular density that defied the laws of aerodynamics. The cowboys realized that they were staring at a living nightmare, a relic from the age of dragons. The chase that ensued was chaotic and fueled by pure adrenaline. The beast took to the air with a clumsy heaviness that shook the ground beneath it. It flew low over the desert floor, its shadow casting a pall over the cactus and the scrub brush. The horses were now in a full stampede, galloping blindly away from the monstrosity that blocked out the sun. The cowboys fired their rifles over their shoulders, hoping to scare the creature away, or perhaps land a lucky shot. The reports of the guns echoed off the canyon walls, sounding like small firecrackers against the roar of the rushing wind generated by the wings. Bullets seemed to bounce off the hide of the creature, as if it were made of iron. The scales protected it from the small caliber rounds of the era. However, the men were persistent and accurate marksmen. They aimed for the softer parts of the anatomy, the underbelly, and the wing joints. After several miles of this desperate pursuit, one of the cowboys managed to land a critical hit. The beast let out a screech that sounded like a steam whistle, mixed with the roar of a lion. It faltered in the air, its rhythm broken by the impact of the lead. The creature crashed into the desert floor with the force of a falling boulder. The impact sent a tremor through the ground that the cowboys could feel through the hooves of their horses. A cloud of dust rose up to mark the grave of of the Thunderbird, the men slowed their horses and circled back, cautiously keeping their rifles trained on the stillness. The silence of the desert returned rushing back in to fill the void left by the noise of the chase. There was no movement from the crash site. The monster lay still, a broken heap of wings and scales amidst the yucca plants. Approaching the carcass was an exercise in courage. The smell emanating from the creature was reportedly atrocious, a mix of sulfur and rotting meat. As they got closer, the true magnitude of their kill became undeniable. The body was larger than their horses, and the wingspan was indeed colossal. The skin was not covered in feathers, but was a thick, leathery hide that was gray and brown in color, blending perfectly with the desert environment. The beak was over 8 feet long, and the jaws were lined with serrated teeth. It was a pterodactyl, a creature that science said had been extinct for 65 million years. The logistics of moving such a monster were daunting. The cowboys knew that no one in Tombstone would believe their story without physical proof. They could not drag the entire carcass back to town, as it was far too heavy for their horses to pull. Instead, they decided to cut off the tip of one wing to take back as evidence. However, the story goes that they eventually returned with a wagon and several other men to retrieve the entire body. It was a task that took immense effort, but the promise of fame and the need for vindication drove them forward. The arrival in the town of Tombstone was nothing short of a spectacle. The wagon creaked under the weight of the strange corpse as it rolled down Allen Street. Shopkeepers and saloon patrons spilled out onto the dusty road to gawk at the monstrosity. The sun was high in the sky, and the shadow of the bird covered the onlookers. Men removed their hats, and women covered the eyes of their children. It was a moment where the mundane world collided with the impossible. The town, which was used to gunfights and lawlessness, was silenced by the presence of the unknown. The editor of the Tombstone Epitaph was quick to seize the opportunity. This was the story of the century, a scoop that would put his paper on the map globally. He dispatched a photographer to document the find. Photography in 1890 was a cumbersome process involving heavy glass plates and dangerous chemicals. The photographer set up his tripod and adjusted the bellows of his camera. He knew that he had to get the exposure exactly right for this. Was a picture that would be reprinted for generations to come. The composition of the photograph is the detail that haunts the memories of so many people. The creature was hauled up and nailed to the side of a large wooden barn, or perhaps a corral wall. Its wings were spread out to their full extent, covering the entire length of the structure. The head hung down limply, the beak nearly touching the dirt. The dark blood of the creature stained the wood of the barn, creating a gruesome contrast. The texture of the wings was clearly visible in the sharp focus of the large format camera showing the veins. and the leathery skin. To provide scale for the viewers, a line of men stood in front of the creature. Reports vary on the number of men, but most memories cite 6 to 8 individuals. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their arms outstretched fingertip to fingertip along the length of the wingspan. Even with this human chain, they could not span the entire width of the monster. The men wore the typical garb of the era, including wide-brimmed hats and vests and boots. Some held rifles, while others just stood with their hands at their sides, looking grim and solemn. The photographer ducked under the black cloth of his camera and ignited the flash powder. There was a blinding burst of light and a puff of white smoke that drifted across the scene. The image was captured on the silver nitrate of the glass plate. The soul of the monster and the likenesses of the men were frozen in time. The cowboys believed they had secured their place in history. They had killed the Thunderbird, and now the world would know that the legends were true. The photo was developed and prepared for publication on April 26, 1890. The Tombstone Epitaph ran an article detailing the event. The headline screamed about a winged monster found in the desert. The text described the creature in vivid detail, matching the accounts of the cowboys. It spoke of the wingspan and the teeth and the difficulty of bringing it to town. However, the article that currently exists in the archives does not include the photograph. It is a wall of text describing the event, but the visual proof is absent. This is where the mystery deepens and the history fractures. The photograph seemingly vanished from history shortly after its alleged creation. Some say it was published in the newspaper, and then the plates were lost or destroyed in a fire. Others claim that it was never published in the epitaph, but was syndicated to other papers across the United States. Yet, despite millions of people claiming to have seen it, no physical copy has ever been produced. It is a phenomenon that defies logic. How can so many people remember the same specific details of an image that does not exist? Decades passed, and the story of the Thunderbird photo became a staple of cryptozoology and the paranormal. In the 1950s and 60s, the interest in the subject was revived by writers and researchers who began to hunt for the lost image. They remembered seeing it in books during their childhoods or in old magazines at the dentist office. The memory was vivid and unshakable. They could describe the grain of the wood on the barn and the faces of the men. But when they went back to find the source, it was gone. One of the most prominent figures in this search was Ivan Terence Sanderson, a biologist and writer who was obsessed with the unexplained. Sanderson claimed that he once possessed a photocopy of the image given to him by a stranger. He stated that he had it in his files for years, but when he went to retrieve it for a book he was writing, the photo was missing. He searched his archives frantically, but it had simply disappeared. This added a sinister layer to the mystery, suggesting that someone or something was actively removing the evidence. Ivan Terence Sanderson was not alone in his frustration. Countless researchers scoured the archives of the Library of Congress and university libraries across the nation. They scrolled through miles of microfilm, looking for the April 1890 edition of the Tombstone Epitaph. They found the article text easily enough confirming that the event was reported, but the photo was never there. The space where it should have been was filled with other news or advertisements. It was as if reality had been edited. The search extended to old tabloids and men's adventure magazines from the mid-20th century. Publications like Saga and True and Argosy were known for printing sensational stories about the paranormal. Many people believed they saw the photo in these pages. Researchers bought entire collections of these magazines, hunting for the elusive image. They found drawings and artistic recreations that looked similar, but never the original photograph. The drawings often depicted the exact scene described, proving that the imagery was pervasive in the culture. The realization that the photo might not exist caused a psychological crisis for many enthusiasts. This phenomenon is often cited as a prime example of the Mandela Effect, where a large group of people share a false memory. The human brain is capable of stitching together fragments of information to create a coherent visual. Perhaps the description in the article, combined with illustrations of pterodactyls, created a phantom memory. But for those who remember the photo, this explanation is insufficient. The memory is too specific, too detailed to be a hallucination. The psychological horror of the situation lies in the uncertainty of reality. If a memory shared by millions can be false, then what else is untrue? Or conversely, if the photo did exist and was erased, what power has the ability to scrub history so thoroughly? The concept suggests a manipulation of the timeline, or a deliberate cover-up by a powerful organization. The men in black, or government agencies, are often blamed for the suppression of evidence regarding cryptids and extraterrestrials. Was it mass hysteria that planted this image in the collective consciousness? The late 19th century was a time of great change and anxiety. The closing of the frontier and the rise of industrialism created a longing for the mysteries of the past. The Thunderbird represented the untamed wilderness that was being lost. Perhaps the people needed the monster to be real, so they manifested the proof in their minds. But this does not explain why people in the modern era, who have no connection to the Wild West, also recall the image. There are other theories that suggest the creature was real, but the photo was a hoax from the start. Perhaps the cowboys constructed a model out of wood and canvas to fool the newspaper. Hoaxes were common in the era of yellow journalism. But even if it was a fake, where is the photo of the fake? A hoax photograph would still be a physical object that should have survived in some archive. The complete eradication of the image is what makes the story so chilling. In the ensuing years, many magazines tried to recreate the photo to illustrate their stories. These recreations often serve to muddy the waters further. When people see these new images, they might confuse them with the original memory. However, witnesses often point out the flaws in the recreations. They say the angle is wrong, or the men are dressed incorrectly, or the bird looks too modern. They insist that the original had a distinct atmosphere, a palpable sense of death and history that the fakes lack. The digital age has brought a new wave of internet sleuths to the case. Forums and websites are dedicated to finding the Thunderbird photo. Users share crude sketches of what they remember, hoping to trigger a breakthrough. Some claim to have seen the photo on early internet sites before it was scrubbed. The digital trail is just as cold as the paper one. The internet, which is supposed to remember everything, seems to have a blind spot for this one specific image. One strange lead came from a man named Harry Marshall Cranmer. In 1963, he wrote a letter to a magazine claiming to have the photo. He described it perfectly, but before researchers could interview him or verify his claim, his house burned down in a mysterious fire. Cranmer survived, but his collection of clippings and magazines was destroyed. It was another dead end that felt too convenient to be a coincidence. The fire seemed to target the evidence directly. The concept of the tulpa from Tibetan mysticism offers a supernatural explanation. A tulpa is a physical being or object created through sheer spiritual or mental discipline. If enough people believe in the Thunderbird photo, with enough intensity, perhaps, they brought it into existence for a fleeting moment, only for it to fade when the focus shifted. Or perhaps the creature itself is a tulpa, a manifestation of the land's anger at the encroachment of civilization. The desert around Tombstone remains a place of secrets. The Dragoon Mountains still stand tall and silent, guarding the location where the beast allegedly fell. Hikers and explorers occasionally report seeing large birds that do not fit the description of local wildlife. They speak of shadows that pass over them and a sense of being watched from the cliffs. The physical remains of the creature, if they ever existed, have long since returned to the dust. The Tombstone Epitaph is still in publication today, and the staff are weary of the inquiries. They have fielded thousands of calls and letters over the last century. They patiently explain that the article exists, but the photo does not. They have searched their own archives more thoroughly than anyone else. They have never found the glass plate or the original print. To them, it is a legend that has gotten out of hand, a story that refuses to die. The possibility that a prehistoric creature survived into the modern age is terrifying. It suggests that our understanding of biology and history is fundamentally flawed. If a pterodactyl could live in Arizona in 1890? What else is hiding in the remote corners of the world? The Thunderbird photo is a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that we do not have all the answers. It challenges our arrogance and our belief that we have mapped every inch of the planet. The fragility of memory is the true ghost in this story. We rely on photographs to anchor our past, to prove that we existed and that the events of our lives were real. When a photograph that anchors a cultural memory is removed, we are left drifting in a sea of doubt. The Thunderbird photo may never be found, but its absence is more powerful than its presence ever could be. It forces us to question the nature of truth and the reliability of our own minds. As the sun sets over the Arizona desert and the long shadows stretch across the sand, one can almost imagine the sound of leathery wings beating against the air, the image of the men standing arm to arm before the crucified beast lingers in the mind's eye. It is a picture that we all know, and yet it is a picture that none of us can hold. It remains the ultimate ghost story, a haunting not by a spirit, but by a void where a memory should be.